Well, the ceasefire may be holding in Israel and Gaza, but the conflict has once again exposed another deadly issue. Communal tensions between Jewish and Arab citizens of Israel have exploded into street riots and violent attacks. Some observers are describing it as the worst outbreak of intercommunity violence in decades, fueled by a combination of tensions, immediate and more long-lasting. I'm joined by the Executive Director of the New Israel Fund, Liam Getreu. Liam, good to talk to you. It was heartbreaking, of course, the violence that unfolded, but there was another level to this, a dangerous level of mob violence on both sides that erupted. What do you think caused that, and what does it indicate to you?
Well, there's been a long, unfortunate inequality, structural inequality that's existed between Jewish citizens of Israel and Arab citizens of Israel. Israel's Declaration of Independence from 1948 was actually incredibly visionary. If you think about it, in the late 1940s, it called for complete equality for all citizens, regardless of race, religion or sex. Upholding that central tenet of the Declaration of Independence, though, has been something else. And even though there are more than 1 million Arab citizens of Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who vote in elections, who work and live side by side with Jews, there has always been an inequality where they haven't been fully integrated in society. At the end of the day, it's a homeland for the Jewish people, and laws, recent laws like the nation-state law that the Netanyahu government passed a few years ago, has entrenched this first-class, second-class status. That's just one of the kind of legal tools that's been used. There's also been other rhetorical tools that's been employed, including by the Prime Minister himself.
And of course, the Palestinians in Gaza don't have Israeli citizenship at all. They almost sort of don't belong anywhere, really, to a degree.
Well, that's why there's kind of two different situations that we're talking about. They're very linked. At the end of the day, the Arab citizens of Israel identify as Palestinian just as their brothers and sisters do in Gaza and the West Bank, and indeed in parts of the Palestinian diaspora as well. But we're talking about two different solutions here. There's a geopolitical outcome that's required between Israelis and Palestinians who live in the occupied territories in the West Bank and Gaza. That requires the formulation of a diplomatic political agreement to sort out that situation. The two-state solution is the most sensible and has been the one that's been on the table for the longest. Inside Israel, though, the answer isn't about diplomatic political solutions. It's about a communal solution where Palestinians in Israel and Jews in Israel have to be able to live together. You can't have 20% of the country being marginalised and discriminated against and 80% of the country being preferenced. They have to be able to live together in equality in order to create a true shared democracy. Democracy in Israel has to be about a Jewish-Arab partnership. And
Liam, you do hear of communities that actually do get on extremely well. They get on with their lives on a daily basis, that there are wonderful community building examples, but do you think because of this inequality it simmers under the surface at all times?
Look, it absolutely does. One of the shining examples of coexistence and shared society in Israel is in the healthcare system. I think something like half of all pharmacists in Israel, for example, are Arab Israeli. There was a story I heard just the other day of two workers in a hospital in Israel. They are great examples of this shared society, but when they go home, they still experience very different realities. That's not a situation that's tenable if you really want to build a society, a liberal democracy that has equality at its core. Now, there have been examples, wonderful examples of civil society organisations that have been taking these great examples of success and trying to amplify them, and also going into of shared society, and also going into and working with the Arab community in Israel in order to address that systematic inequality. These two components is the only way that Israel is going to be able to move forward in a more harmonious way and avoid the kind of horrific violence between the Jewish and Arab communities that we've seen.
And then after a bruising interlude of the last 11 days where we saw, over 200 people die, bombardments, rockets being fired as well within Israel and causing a lot of uncertainty. How do you rebuild from that?
Well, again, that requires Yeah, the Gaza issue requires a political, diplomatic solution. Even Israel's military knows that it can't solve this problem militarily. We've seen that this is a result, what's happened recently in Gaza, has been a result of an inability to resolve those core elements of the conflict. While that doesn't happen, we're going to see these continued rounds of violence occur because those inherent elements of the conflict are unresolved. There's always going to be violence until there is a real opportunity for Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank to achieve statehood, to achieve the self-determination that was given to the Jewish people in Israel 70 years ago. That now needs to be realised for Palestinians as well.
The political instability, we've had, 4 elections, still no sign that there's going to be any outcome to this, although there's an attempt to form a coalition. With that going on, is there any likelihood of any substantial move forwards?
The remarkable part was that on the eve of this recent round of violence, it looked like a change coalition would perhaps be able to form a government and move Israel forward out of this cycle, like you said, of 4 elections in 2 years. That government would have been led by, quite frankly, a pro-annexation right-wing leader, Naftali Bennett. And it would have also, though, been joined by a wide spectrum of parties, everyone from Labour and the left-wing Zionist party Meretz to even an Islamist party called Ra'am. Bringing Arab Israelis into that coalition would have been a remarkable achievement, would have been the first time an independent Arab party would have been part of a governing coalition in Israel's history. And so if you just think about that, it means that for more than 70 years, Arab Israelis have been able to vote but haven't had a true, real voice in how the country is governed. That was about to happen. Then we saw this round of violence and things backed off. But opposition leader Yair Lapid still has, I think, about 8 or 9 days left of his mandate to form the government. A few hours ago, I would have said guaranteed 5th elections. That would have been my prediction. A few hours ago, though, we've seen maybe that the parties have come back to the table to try and achieve a governing coalition. One of the scary parts about the Netanyahu faction and that he's been able to cobble together have been these kahanists, these far-right Jewish supremacists. Israel's police chief pointed the finger at one of them, Itamar Ben-Gvir. He used to have on the wall a photo of a man who committed a mass murder attack in Hebron more than 20 years ago now. He was targeted. He was pointed at by the police chief of Israel for causing these internal intifadas inside Israel. Those kinds of voices are unfortunately all too prevalent on the Jewish side, and there are certainly on the Arab and the Palestinian side those voices as well. Our job, I think, as supporters of democracy, as supporters of Israelis and Palestinians, needs to be to mobilise and support moderate voices to bring Jews and Arabs together.
We will watch with interest as those days play out. Liam, thank you so much.
Thanks, Beverley.